3 iron cages swing high above the German city of Münster, creaking in the cold wind. They hang from the tower of St. Lambert's Church, nearly 40 meters up. At first glance, they might seem like some kind of strange old decoration. But inside those cages, human skeletons once hung the remains of 3 men who claimed they were building a new Jerusalem, a holy kingdom on earth. But instead, they turned Münster into a nightmare. Their bones have long since vanished, but the cages are still there. You can visit them today. Tourists snap photos, unaware that they're standing beneath the legacy of one of the darkest, most disturbing chapters in the history of the Protestant Reformation. This isn't just a story of gruesome punishment. It's the story of how an entire city fell into religious madness, a cult took over, and what followed was violence, terror, and cannibalism. It all started with a prophecy and ended with torture and iron cages. Let's rewind to the year 1534. Münster, a wealthy trading hub in the heart of Germany, had just converted to Protestantism. Like many cities of the time, it was caught between old Catholic loyalties and the rising wave of Protestant reform. The political situation was unstable, and the people were anxious about what was coming next. Then arrived a man named Jan Matthys, a Dutch preacher, charismatic, intense, and apocalyptic. Matthys didn't just preach Protestant reform, he brought something far more radical. He was part of a sect called the Anabaptists, a group that rejected infant baptism, condemned private property, and denied the authority of secular rulers. But Matthys took it even further. He claimed he was a prophet sent by God to establish his kingdom on earth. And Münster, he declared, would be the holy city, the New Jerusalem. His message was terrifying, but also deeply appealing. The world was ending, yes, but those who followed him would be saved. In Matthys' vision, there would be no rich or poor, no hunger, no injustice. All property would be shared. And anyone who resisted God's will? Wiped out. His words hit hard, especially with the people who had nothing to lose. Poor artisans, bankrupt merchants, hungry laborers. By the winter of 1534, his following exploded. The promise of a perfect society where suffering would end that was powerful. And so began one of the most extreme religious revolutions Europe had ever seen. In February 1535, Matthys' supporters seized control of Münster's government through rigged elections and brutal intimidation. Overnight, the city became unrecognizable. Catholics and moderate Protestants were driven out. Families were kicked out of their homes in the freezing cold, barefoot in the snow, left to die if they refused to leave. Those who resisted were executed publicly, not just to kill them, but to send a message: this was now God's city. Then they went further, much further. Private property was outlawed. Everything, homes, gold, clothing, was declared communal. Merchants who had spent their lives building businesses lost everything. The economy crumbled. But Matthys claimed it was the price of salvation. Soon he announced that God had given him a new set of divine laws that replaced the Bible itself. Marriage as people knew it was abolished. Monogamy was declared sinful. Men were now required to take multiple wives in order to multiply the faithful before the end times. Women had no say. Refused to marry? You'd be executed for defying God. The scale of violence that followed was horrifying. Girls as young as 12 were forced into marriages with elderly men. Wives were passed around and reassigned like livestock. It wasn't just a theocracy, it was a state of institutionalized sexual violence, enforced by terror. And still, Matthys pushed the boundaries. In April 1535, convinced he could defeat the enemy with God's help, he led a suicidal attack on the Catholic forces, who were now surrounding Münster. It ended as you'd expect. He was killed almost instantly. But instead of falling apart, the movement mutated. Enter John van Leyden, just 25 years old, another Dutch Anabaptist, and even more dangerous than Matthys. He declared himself King David of the New Jerusalem. He wore a golden crown, moved into a confiscated palace, declared himself God's chosen ruler. He even appointed 16 wives, one of whom had been married to Matthys before his death. Under van Leyden, things got even worse. The siege of Münster had now entered a new phase, one of starvation and despair. Catholic and Protestant armies had united to crush what they saw as a mad religious rebellion. For 14 months, the city was cut off. No food, no supplies, no hope. Inside the walls, Van Leyden maintained control through fear. Anyone who complained, hoarded food, or even whispered doubts was executed. And these executions weren't done in secret, they were public rituals. Everyone was required to watch, clap, celebrate, or risk becoming the next victim. One of the most infamous moments came when Van Leyden executed one of his own wives, a 19-year-old woman named Elisabeth Wanscherer, because she questioned his authority. He personally beheaded her in the town square while singing hymns. Then, in a grotesque display, he forced his other wives to dance around her body as if it were some kind of religious festival. Meanwhile, the population was literally starving. People began eating leather, grass, and finally each other. Cannibalism became part of daily life. Van Leyden encouraged it. In fact, when people were executed for being unfaithful, their bodies were cooked and eaten considered holy food by the starving faithful. But no amount of terror could keep a city alive without food. On June 25, 1535, the nightmare came to an end. The trade from within Münster's gates were opened to the Catholic army. What followed was a 3-day massacre. Nearly every man left in the city was killed. The Anabaptist kingdom of God was destroyed. But the story didn't end there. The so-called kingdom of God was in ruins. But for the Catholic authorities, it wasn't enough to simply retake Münster. They wanted revenge. Not just for themselves, but for all of Europe. The horrors of the Anabaptist regime had shocked Christian leaders everywhere. And now they needed to make an example, one so brutal, so unforgettable, that no one would dare try anything like it again. Jan van Leyden and his 2 top lieutenants, Bernhard Knipperdoling and Bernhard Krechting, were captured alive, not by accident. The authorities wanted them to suffer, and they planned every step of their punishment with careful, cold precision. Their execution wouldn't just be public. It would be theatrical, a spectacle of pain and humiliation designed to terrorize. It was more than vengeance, it was propaganda. The date was set January 22, 1536. Thousands of spectators gathered in Münster's main square. Church officials, nobles, military commanders, they all came to watch. They weren't just attending an execution. They were witnessing a ritual, a warning. The 3 men were brought out one by one, stripped to the waist, tied to stakes. And then the real torture began. Red-hot pincers were used to tear flesh from their bodies slowly, methodically. First the arms, then the chest, the legs, the genitals. The pain was beyond comprehension. But the executioners had been trained not to kill too quickly. The goal wasn't death. It was endurance, suffering. A show. Van Leyden didn't scream, not at first. He kept preaching, kept declaring that God would raise him from the dead. Witnesses said his faith didn't break, even as his body was destroyed piece by piece. His tormentors were reportedly stunned by how long he remained conscious. Knipperdoling and Krechting weren't so strong. They passed out from the pain repeatedly, but they were revived with cold water, only to be tortured again. Their agony stretched over 6 hours. Finally, the end came. Each man was stabbed through the heart with a dagger. Quick, clean. But that was only the beginning of their final punishment. The bodies were taken and placed into 3 iron cages specially made to hold human skeletons. The cages were then hoisted high onto the tower of St. Lambert's Church, 40 meters in the air, where everyone in the city could see them, where travelers could spot them from miles away. And there the bodies remained, left to rot in public view. The symbolism couldn't have been clearer. St. Lambert's was Münster's main church, visible from every corner of the city, from the surrounding countryside, from the roads that led in and out. The message was burned into the skyline. This is what happens to heretics. As the days passed, the corpses began to decay. The stench spread across the city. Birds tore at the flesh. Rain and wind stripped the bodies until they were nothing but white skeletons rattling in the wind. But the cages weren't removed. Authorities left them hanging there for years. For decades, the skeletons stayed in place. Generations of children grew up under the watchful gaze of the so-called kings of Münster. The effect was chilling. The iron cages became a permanent part of city life, a dark landmark looming above everyday existence. And it worked. The Anabaptist movement was wiped out in Germany. Nowhere else did a group try anything close to what had happened in Münster. The terror was too fresh, the warning too clear. But as with all symbols, the meaning began to shift over time. To many, the cages were a victory, a reminder that order had been restored, that God had triumphed over madness. But for a few radical groups, Van Leyden and his comrades became something else entirely, martyrs. Stories spread about their courage in the face of torture, about how they never broke. Some whispered that maybe, just maybe, they were right all along. It's a strange legacy. The cages meant to humiliate and erase them ended up preserving their memory in iron. Eventually, by the late 1700s, the original cages had to be taken down for safety reasons. But the story didn't end there either. In 1898, the city of Münster reinstalled exact replicas in the very same spot, not as a celebration but as a historical marker, a grim reminder. You can still see them today. Tourists walk through the square, staring up at the rusted cages without always knowing what they're looking at. Some take photos, some ask questions. Few understand the full horror behind them. But if you stand there long enough, it's impossible not to feel something. A sense of unease, of strangeness. Those cages aren't just historical artifacts, they're monuments to a time when faith turned to fire and hope curdled into violence. Because that's what the story of Münster really is. A cautionary tale. It shows what happens when a community in crisis puts its trust in prophets instead of reason. When a desire for justice turns into fanaticism. When the promise of paradise becomes a license to destroy. Jan van Leyden genuinely believed he was building the kingdom of God. He thought he was chosen. But he created a nightmare city where children were forced into marriage, where neighbors ate one another to survive, where human beings danced around corpses in the name of salvation. The people of Münster wanted something better, a new beginning. And for a moment they believed they had it. But within months they were starving, terrified, and dying, all because they followed a man who said he spoke for God. And then, when it was over, came the cages. Iron cages that didn't just punish. They haunted. They still do.